Good evening again, everyone. My name is Sohail Joya. I am really excited for so many folks to be joining us from all over the nation to kind of unpack the upcoming February 2025 public forum debate topic regarding the United States acceding to the International Criminal Court. I think that this is a timely discussion. It is not one that is particularly new to debate. I remember as a young debater myself actually debating about the United States joining the International Criminal Court. And if I remember correctly, it has basically been something that has been debated for just about every format of debate in the past 4 years. It's almost cyclical to some extent. So I know in Lincoln Douglas debate, it is about one half of the topic for January and February. This really gives us an idea as to what it is that you should anticipate and expect. This is a relatively short and quick lecture, but the idea is really to kind of ensure that you all as students kind of recognize what the core controversies are and allow this to be a starting place for your research, not the end. However, all of you have the opportunity to ask and answer questions of myself, and I'm more than willing to answer those things for you. So again, as you can see, this is the topic analysis for the February 2025 public forum resolution regarding the United States acceding to the Rome Statute and being a full member of the International Criminal Court. So our objectives today are relatively simple. The idea is for us to kind of understand the topic's terms of arts and what side constraints or burdens likely would be. Preferably, and I do wish I spent a little bit more time on the second bullet point, I'd like for us to kind of unpack the topic's core controversies, not just in relation to the United States domestic sort of response to joining the International Criminal Court, but also more particularly about international relations. International law is obviously going to be massive, but international relations is really about kind of schools of thought to understand why states behave the way in which they do. I also think that this is a good opportunity for us to talk about core concepts and expected positions that you should anticipate from the affirmative and the negative. And again, this is really an opportunity to establish a foundation to jumpstart your research. This is not going to be the end-all be-all. And if you are interested in more secondary or next level concepts, questions, concerns, or really strategic options that you can have in your debate rounds, by all means, feel free to email me, feel free to reach out. We're relatively easy to get a hold of. But I'd also be remiss if I did not talk to you about the upcoming Tri-State Debate League tournament. The Tri-State Debate League is in its first sort of year, and we are thrilled about the amount of participation that we've got. We also are very fortunate where we have established a circuit that has one-day tournaments, but 4 single flights of public forum along with finals. During that final round, if you are not in the final round, what we like to do is bring Debate Institute instructors to you. There will be a tutorial during the final round where you can learn about a particular skill or a concept, depending on what it is that you sign up for. We also have, I think, easily pound for pound, the best judging in all of New York City. Excellent hospitality. And March 1st is our next tournament. So that's March 1st, which is a Saturday, and it's hosted at the beautiful location of the New School in Manhattan. It's an absolutely incredible campus that's also going to be co-hosted and ran by the New Schools Debate Program, which is one of the premier debate programs in all of D8 and certainly one of the best in New York State. So if that's something that interests you, we'd love to have you. In addition to that, we are offering competitors the opportunity to win and earn Summer Debate Institute scholarships at the University of Houston. The University of Houston honors debate workshop this summer has 2 different 2-week options. If you like what you hear, if you like what you hear and learn from me in particular, the University of Houston honors debate workshops are, I think, a wonderful opportunity and a way for you to kind of get a head start onto your season for next year. And again, you have the opportunity to be able to earn scholarships for that institute. And if you're wanting to learn a little bit more, feel free to simply Google UH Honors Debate Workshop, or again, reach out and I can provide you additional information. With that being said, I think it's smart for us to kind of dive right into the topic. For those of you who are a little bit uncertain about the specific wording of the resolution, here it is for you. I'm a big believer that you should break down resolutions into 3 parts. There is an actor, an action, and an object. The actor is effectively And again, if you're a student of mine, you're probably incredibly sick of hearing this. I don't know how many topics we've had where we've broken down the resolution and you figured this out by now. The actor is, the entity or agent that is actually doing the action. The verbiage, as you can imagine, is what is the action. And then finally, the object is who is actually being affected by the action. So if Jimmy kicked the ball, Jimmy would be your actor. The action would be kicked. And then the ball is the object that is being kicked. I think it is wise for you to take a moment and try to, kind of effectively realize which parts of the resolution fall under which category. Go ahead and see if you can figure that out yourself. Resolve: the United States should accede to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Who is the actor? What is the action? Who is the object? This should not be too terribly difficult for you. If you want to, kind of post your answers in the chat, feel free. But I want to challenge you to be able to make sure that you're using all parts of the resolution to kind of break this down. Fortunately, this is a relatively straightforward policy style resolution. I do not mean that this is the policy debate topic, but rather this is a resolution that requires a particular policy prescription. In this case, acceding to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So hopefully you figured out who your actor is. It is the United States. You'll notice that the United States federal government is not the agent here, mostly because it's not necessary to do so. This is not a domestic policy, but one regarding treaties. Should accede to. And I know a lot of folks are wondering, well, what is should? Is should really a verb? The answer is yes. And I think it's a very important bit of context because far too often, I think way too many public forum debaters, especially in more local, non-national circuits, meaning tournaments that are a little bit more localized, relying on lay judging and community members to evaluate decisions. That word should can get really goofy and strange. And what I mean by that is there are going to be a lot of negative teams that will probably reflexively say, oh, well, the United States would never agree to this. Thus, that's a reason to negate. Well, should is the operative verb here. It's not about what would happen, but rather what should happen. And then finally, the object is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. A couple of key terms that I think are important. If you ever see any of my lectures or anything else like that, what I attempt to do is bold things that are important, and any definitions or conceptual understandings are oftentimes in green. If it's an affirmative concept or argument, I usually put that in red. If it's a negative one, I usually put that in blue. For those of you, including my own students, who think that blue indicates the affirmative, you are one lost child, and hopefully you kind of get hip to it. But regardless, accede by the actual Oxford English Dictionary indicates agree to a demand, request, or a treaty. Obviously, this is a treaty. In this context, the United States would be agreeing to become a full member of the ICC via a complete signing and ratification process via the Rome Statute. The Rome Statute itself outlines the court's jurisdiction, the structure, and the procedures of the International Criminal Court, which we'll get into in a moment. But I think that the reason why this is important is the Rome Statute is the treaty that created the ICC. It is important for you to understand that. I think the topic committee got a little bit too, wordy about the formal logistical nature of what affirming and what fiating as the AF would need to look like and what it needs to be. But I think it's relatively straightforward for you to just realize that AF is US in ICC. Neg is US not in ICC. It's relatively simple. I mean, it's really straightforward. This is not one of those topics where the resolutional wording allows for ambiguity that allows you to do something finicky or strategic or something that's probably not especially, predictable. I think that is sort of the zeitgeist and meta of public forum at this point in time, which is to find the least intrinsic link to the largest high magnitude impact. So that way you could outweigh your opponents without having to really worry about, in this instance, people being prepared. I don't think this is a topic we're going to have a lot of that. Of course, there are going to be people who push the boundaries of it, but ensuring that you understand that the affirmative is merely advocating for the acceding and the signing on of the treaties to the Rome Statute, I think is helpful. Other components that I think are important about the Rome Statute here is that this is just, again, the formal name of the international treaty to create the court itself. The processes of how the United States joins the criminal court is relatively straightforward, but again, I think is necessary for young debaters to understand. Typically, there are a few different parts of the legal processes outlined by the United States Constitution about what is the role of the executive, What is it that the president can do? Is this a bureaucratic agency? No. It allows the executive, however, to have diplomatic negotiations with treaties, so that way they can particularly amend, especially bilateral treaties. In this instance, the Rome Statute is not bilateral. It is a multilateral treaties to establish not just the International Criminal Court, but for people to sign on to become full participating members of the court. If the United States were to accede to the Rome Statute, the diplomatic negotiation process is typically done by the executive branch. Usually some type of presidential conference occurs. And then secondly, it requires Senate approval. So the United States Constitution in Article 2 indicates that the United States allows the executive branch, in this case the president, to negotiate and sign treaties, but they don't become binding actual, domestic U.S. policy and law unless they're ratified by the United States Senate. This does not, like typical domestic policy, require anything really to go to the House of Representatives. It goes straight to the top chamber of the United States Congress. In this case is obviously the Senate. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee actually holds and conducts hearings to talk about the treaty's provisions and allow for questions to be approached by the general body. And then in order, again, for the ratification of the treaty to be binding United States law, it requires an overwhelming majority of senators that are present. So I want to be clear about that. This is just simply if there's enough senators for a quorum, there needs to be a 2/3 majority. A lot of you are like, oh, that just means 66 or 67 sort of senators. That is the case so long as those folks are actually all present. I think you all be surprised, especially with how campaigning operates. Not all states, or not all senators rather, are present. Usually they try to be for large pieces of legislation. And then finally, the president needs to formally ratify the treaty after it's been approved by the Senate. Usually this is where you see kind of like what Trump is doing with executive orders. It's usually a big hullabaloo. And in the West Wing of the White House, the president has like a symbolic and formalized kind of signing, if you will. All of that is what we've talked about, and we have not really talked about what the ICC is or what the International Criminal Court is. For those of you that are a little bit uninitiated, the International Criminal Court is an intergovernmental organization and is sort of the project of international tribunal courts that is seated in The Hague in the Netherlands. I'm a little bit concerned with the conflation that I'm already seeing with young public forum debaters about the alphabet soup of all of this. ICC, ICJ, UNSC. What is the relation between all of them? I'll discuss that in a moment, and I will allow you all the opportunity to ask those things. And it can be very easy to get lost in the sauce here, but I think if you're kind of paying attention and being a little bit more pointed about what it is that you need to kind of understand about the distinction between the International Criminal Court and other sort of enterprises or entities like the International Court of Justice, I think you're going to be in good shape. The Rome Statute itself was created in 1999, but it wasn't until there were enough signatories and folks who joined the Rome Statute where the ICC really kind of developed in its infancy. It was established in 2002. Obviously, as you can imagine, that is a very young court. It is one of the youngest international sort of jurisdictions in the entire world. And I think that is oftentimes why there is a controversy. It is not universally sort of accepted that this is a good particular proposal. However, the ICC, especially by those who purport its importance, have indicated that the ICC is an indication of really human civilization. It is an opportunity for there to be a universal standard and metric towards justice, and has really been a game changer in the way in which we discuss international law and the universal application of human rights, which is, for better or worse, kind of a byproduct of the United Nations. But again, at the same time, the ICC is not part of the United Nations. So you may be asking, well, who is in the ICC? This little handy-dandy map is a few years old, but it's still relatively important and helpful. If you look in the green, those are nations who have completely ratified and are full members of the International Criminal Court. They have signed the Rome Statute. They have gone through other domestic processes and channels necessary to make the court legally binding in its domestic application. So you'll see a good amount of South America, Oceania, just about all of Europe, and roughly even half of Africa are a part of the International Criminal Court. There are 125 states that are parties to the Rome Statute of the court. Now, you'll also see some nations that are in yellow. There are 29 nations that have signed the Rome Statute but have not ratified it. So what I mean by this is that the law of these treaties, it obliges these states to refrain from things that the ICC think are bad, which we'll talk about in a moment. There are four sort of main categories of crimes that fall under the jurisdiction of the ICC. So these 29 nations have effectively signed the statute, but have not gone through the ratification process or have acceded, if you will, to borrow the language of the resolution, into making it domestic policy. In particular, there are 4 signatory states: Israel in 2002, the United States also in 2002, mostly due to concerns about George Bush's war on terror, which first started in Afghanistan and then bled into Iraq. The United States, Israel, Sudan in 2008, after they were accused and tried of genocide, and in Russia in 2016, after the United Nations had a Security Council resolution that did get rejected. There was, however, enough evidence procured that Vladimir Putin is guilty of war crimes, including displacement of children in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Those 4 nations, regardless of what year they have decided to do this, have all informed the United Nations Security General that they're not fully expecting to become parties of the International Criminal Court and have no obligations to adhere to the Rome Statute and follow through with International Criminal Court policies. And obviously, one of the things that you'll notice about all 4 of those nations is that they're relatively self-interested. This is going to be a common sort of thread in this lecture, is that those nations who are very skeptical or concerned about the International Criminal Court and not joining entirely or being a full signatory or a full member are really just looking out for themselves to ensure that they are not tried by the ICC. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but there are also 41 additional states that you'll see here in gray. They haven't signed. They have not acceded to the Rome Statute, and a lot of them, much like those 4 nations who did sign and kind of reneged, are concerned about whether or not the jurisdiction of the ICC and the categories of crimes that it looks to deal with and prosecute, could that kind of come back to haunt them. This includes China. This also includes India. Once more, Russia, the United States, Sudan, and Israel have effectively kind of pulled out of their initial signatory status of the Rome Statute. This probably leads us to, the more intrinsic question that many of you may have, which is, what is it that the ICC does? This really kind of stems from the tradition of the Nuremberg trials. For those of you who are a little bit unfamiliar, post-World War II, the Nuremberg trials were an international criminal tribunal for Nazis. Oftentimes, you may have heard colloquially that just following orders is not a justification for committing war crimes and is not a justification or an excuse to carry out acts of genocide as mandated by a superior officer. The Nuremberg trials were very, very big, as you can imagine. It oftentimes had the cries of never again, that genocide is a unique, particular evil that ought to really have an international concern to find mechanisms, not just simply to dismiss them and to mitigate the likelihood of genocide, but really to deter those who have created those problems. You may also see in some of your preliminary research that the ICC also is the product of ICTY or ICTR, which stands for the International Criminal Tribunal in Yugoslavia, as well as the International Criminal Tribunal of Rwanda, both in 1993 and 1997, respectfully. As you can imagine, the Rome Statute's creation in 1998 is no accident. The idea is we keep on continuously having these problems of genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. where we should just establish a permanent court that establishes tribunal precedent to prosecute individuals for only the most serious of crimes under international law. A lot of the research that you'll see with the ICC, if you're doing any explainer articles, whether you're looking at Vox, that's VOX, not FOX, a lot of what they try to kind of emphasize to readers is that the ICC really is not interested in being a litigatory sort of resource for the international community, whether it's the United Nations or any other type of international legal correspondence. They only want to be something that is used as a last resort and only reserved for the most heinous and atrocious kind of war crimes out there. In particular, the ICC is focused on, it says four, and I know it says four, and we can talk about four, but it's really three categories of crimes. The first is genocide. I think a lot of you are relatively familiar with what that concept is. Next are war crimes. So war crimes, believe it or not, there is legal precedent about rules of engagement and the appropriate conduct in war, in particular about proportionality and about preemption. So if nations or certain military militias or groups or individuals are guilty of very, very egregious violations of the laws of war, if they are, for example, targeting civilians, using weapons, like, for example, chemical and biological weaponry that have been prohibited by international law, for example, Agent Orange, mustard gas, things like that, or torturing prisoners or keeping prisoners of war captive in a fashion that is incredibly inhumane and dehumanizing, that would constitute war crimes. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the same sort of thing happened with Vladimir Putin in 2016. The ICC felt that there was enough evidence to justify charging Vladimir Putin of intentionally targeting children and hospitals. The same thing is true of Israel. There are a number of Israeli politicians who are being tried by the ICC. Then again, there are crimes against humanity. Crimes against humanity are oftentimes kind of focused on systemic sort of attacks that are so widespread that it is believed to be intentional onto civilians. I think this is oftentimes what you're going to be talking about when you Google ICC on like the news component. The first few hits you're going to get are about Benjamin Netanyahu and the sort of allegation that's, there's a lot of evidence to merit it that the Israeli occupation of Gaza in particular is intentionally attempting to kill civilians, which obviously indicates genocide, but also the bombing of hospitals, bombing of civilian locations and refugee entity areas, all constitute crimes against humanity. Crimes of aggression is the fourth sort of desire of the International Criminal Court to prosecute. However, they never have. Why? Well, that's because there's no necessarily like singular definition on an agreement about what is a crime of aggression. Oftentimes the idea, and really what the Rome Statute attempted to kind of really kind of introduce in international law, is that you could start charging, people, militias, governments of inciting war. That has not been something the ICC has really tried to utilize, mostly because there's no court precedent for it, and it would be very difficult to sort of prove, and oftentimes it gets really muddy because whether or not there is a justification by the nation that may be launching an invasion, it's just incredibly difficult for the courts to ascertain. So they've usually limited themselves to the first of the four categories of crime. So these are the crimes that are under the jurisdiction of the ICC. And again, it's an incredibly young court. What is it that they have done? Well, the ICC's open investigations into about 30 different sort of cases in various locations, but they've included locations like Sudan, Uganda, the Central African Republic, the DRC, colloquially known as, the Congo, Libya, Mali, Georgia, and a few others. But one of the things you'll probably notice from that sort of brief list is that the vast majority of these investigations have happened in Africa. And as of this year, the ICC has convicted 10 individuals in 6 completed trials. There are more cases that are ongoing. They're at different various stages of prosecution, mostly because of the fact that just because they issue an arrest warrant, it doesn't mean that they're going to try these folks. As we'll discuss later, The ICC relies on its member states to be able to not only detain and arrest somebody that they have a warrant out for, but also to bring them to The Hague in the Netherlands. The ICC has also had some serious challenges in securing convictions. Oftentimes there is a difficulty in accessing or acquiring evidence that is considered to be unbiased and non-politicized. There's also an involvement of very, very high political figures who oftentimes probably have machinations at work behind the curtains to insulate themselves. That is, however, a little bit of a change since 2016, and I think is especially true in 2024, where you have Israeli and Russian officials who are actually, kind of facing actual convictions and trials. I don't know if this helps per se, but I do think that, understanding how the ICC operates matters. Again, we talked about jurisdiction, about what crimes they actually oversee, but where are they actually able to do this? Well, the jurisdiction of the ICC is really limited to a few things. So crimes that are committed on the territory of a state party to the Rome Statute. So, for example, South Africa, they signed on to the Rome Statute if there is a crime against humanity, a war crime or a genocide that occurred in South Africa, the ICC has jurisdiction to investigate. If there is a crime that occurs in the nation of a member of the ICC, the state can not only investigate, but prosecute anybody that they feel should be tried. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're guilty or that they'll find them guilty, but they will try them in the court in The Hague. Another thing, too, is that they can actually exercise jurisdiction over crimes committed by nationals of any state party, regardless of where the crime occurred. So, for example, if you are affirming and you are saying that the United States should accede to the Rome Statute, become full members of the ICC, if an American service member goes to, let's say, Afghanistan, I know the United States pulled out, but let's just say for the sake of argument, just to parallel what the George Bush administration was concerned about, goes to Afghanistan and commits or is suspected to commit a war crime, they then could be subject to International Criminal Court, not just investigation, but prosecution. So even though the crime happened in Afghanistan, a nation that is not a party, if the United States were a party, any American citizen could then face jurisdiction of the ICC. Another is a state party to the Rome Statute can refer a case to the ICC. So if a nation is very concerned or troubled, usually by what's going on in a border nation, they can refer a case to the ICC. In addition to that, the prosecutor for the ICC, who's currently someone who is incredibly politicized, Kareem, and I forgot the last name, but I know it alliterates. He is somebody who was threatened by the Israeli government and was kind of, attempted to be intimidated into not issuing out arrest warrants against Netanyahu and his cabinet. That person can initiate investigations of their own initiative. That does not necessarily, again, mean that that is a guilty verdict. And then finally, and this is where I think things can be confusing, I just told you that the ICC is not a part of the United Nations. That is true. However, the United Nations Security Council can refer a situation to the ICC similar to how a state party can. Now, again, the United States, Russia, and China, three of the big five, if you will, on the United Nations Security Council are not full members, and some are not even signatories of the Rome Statute. But if they felt like this is a crime against humanity or a war crime or a genocide, and they felt like it would be wise for the ICC to investigate, they can refer the situation to the ICC to not just investigate, but again, prosecute. Now, you may be thinking, well, what's the big deal? What's the issue? Or in particular, does the ICC kind of take on these cases of their own volition? The answer is no. The ICC operates, again, on a principle of complementary justice. For my own students who were there with, talking to me last week, this is, again, sort of an extension of the concept of, listen, the International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. There is no interest, according to them, of course. Now, critics and skeptics are less persuaded by this kind of, last resort sort of philosophy that the ICC contends that they adhere to. But again, they are not interested in taking on casual cases, and they're not interested in taking on cases unless there is a failure by the domestic entity, usually the nation and that federal government, of protecting their own folks. So the ICC operates on the principle of complementary justice, meaning that it only has jurisdiction if the domestic legal system is unable, meaning that they're a cleft state or a failed state, and they just simply don't have, the monopolization on violence to kind of conduct typical social services like, court cases. If they just simply have failed, and usually a lot of war-torn nations do not have the resources or ability to do it, or more importantly, if they're unwilling to prosecute their crimes. If you're Robert Mugabe and you are guilty of serious crimes against humanity, obviously you're not going to prosecute yourself. So again, this is where the ICC says that they will only investigate or prosecute crimes if those national courts refuse to investigate them themselves. The ICC will defer to those national courts, and only if that principle of complementary justice has failed on the domestic level will they actively try to intervene. If the country is unwilling, the ICC, again, can step in. I think this is an important concept to understand. If you are affirmative, a lot of negative arguments that are going to, come from everyone from traditional negative debaters to, more nuanced national circuit debaters, they're going to contend, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, that the United States, by acceding to the ICC, would effectively be forfeiting its own jurisdiction, and it's a kind of allowing and agreeing to an international legal concept that supersedes American policy, which especially Republicans, but don't get me wrong, make no mistake, a lot of the United States hesitation to join the ICC is very bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats together are concerned about the idea of an international entity having jurisdiction over American citizens, and especially its service members. The argument, if you are affirmative, is that you can no link this. Like, there's not a link turn here per se, but there's definitely a no link. Please don't say D-link. That is not the same thing. That is what noobs say. A no link argument to the negative is that violating domestic policy is something that's really unlikely. The United States should have military tribunals of its own, and they do, of folks who have committed war crimes. I think there are a lot of folks who rightfully contend that the United States is not taking this seriously enough and are kind of getting a liberal get out of jail free card to some people who've done some really heinous and terrible things. But I do think if you understand this concept of complementary justice and you're able to explain it to people who aren't in debate, right, but are smart folks, like, maybe some friends of yours that aren't on the debate program, your parents, and maybe even a teacher who's not a debate coach, if you can explain to them how complementary justice means that there's no real risk that the United States is now subject to international policy that supersedes domestic kind of national sovereignty, you're going to be in really good shape. Another core concept that I wanted to talk to you about is the R2P, the responsibility to protect. Responsibility to protect is a principle in international relations and international law, as well as in some human rights discourses that emphasize the duty of nations and the international community, both nations and their federal jurisdiction, as well as international, global sort of communities, to prevent and respond to atrocities. Not long after the International Criminal Court kind of came into being in 2002, 2005, there was the next sort of World Summit. The United Nations accepted this as part of its reform process. And the R2P is something that you're going to see in a lot of the evidence. If you've started researching a little bit already, you're going to see that R2P acronym, and it's necessary for you to understand what that means. In short, you'll see those three little hyphens and bullets underneath. I'm really trying to, ensure that there's as much resource as possible for you to understand these core concepts. But R2P basically contends that every nation has the responsibility to protect its own populations. And that also includes protectorateships. So, for example, you may be thinking, well, Palestine's its own nation. Why is that an issue? Well, Palestine is not considered to have its own independent statehood and is in fact, an occupied territory of Israel. And so even though Israel does not consider Palestinians to be citizens, international law indicates that Israel has a responsibility to protect Palestinians. And if they are not doing that, they're violating that responsibility. Thus, that leads to, I think, the second sort of bullet point here is that the international community has a responsibility to assist, marginalized populations that their government is refusing to protect them. And that's especially true if they're not just refusing to protect and defend them, but are instead the actual entities inflicting harm upon them. The international community needs to assist those states in building its capacities to protect its population. And what happens if it's intentional? Well, that leads to the third. And again, force as a last resort is something that the international community talks about vehemently. If a nation state fails to protect its populations and atrocities are occurring and all of the formats of non-military, non-coercive measures fail, the international community then has a responsibility to take collective action. In order for them to do that legally through the international law and apparatus, it needs to go through the United Nations Security Council. That would allow for the international legal use of force to protect the population. Military intervention, as proposed by the United Nations Security Council or by any other kind of international legal entity, is incredibly rare. It does not happen often. The United States attempted to do something similar to this by appealing to the United Nations General Assembly about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq to justify its invasion. The United Nations General Assembly, really kind of refused to allow that protection by force metric. However, the ICC has really solidified and cemented the responsibility to protect framework, especially in regard to holding specific individuals accountable for mass atrocities. The ICC also kind of focuses on holding, specific people to court. And the idea there is that it will create a deterrence mechanism for future sort of infractions and injustices. And again, the court still operates on a principle of complementary justice. It only steps in when those nations refuse to have a responsibility to protect. Talked a lot about what the ICC is. Believe it or not, I think it would be helpful for us to talk about what is the ICC not. The ICJ is not the ICC. The ICC is not the ICJ. Again, there's a lot of alphabet soup here. There's a lot of overlap, but they're not the same. The ICJ is an actual product of the United Nations. The ICC is not. I know that's confusing because both of these courts are held in The Hague, which is in the Netherlands. They're held in the exact same city. However, the ICJ is not necessarily equipped to deal with individual cases or crimes. In fact, most of what they do is settle legal disputes between nations. So the ICJ is for nations to go to court. And usually they kind of deal with things from like diplomatic concerns to trade disputes, environmental protection concerns, and also like accusations of violations of international law, but not about, crimes against humanity, not about genocide, not about aggression. Oftentimes, the ICJ is invoked when there's a territorial dispute. For example, China, the Philippines, and about 4 other nations had a large sort of disagreement about who had a rightful claim to a series of islands called the Spratly Islands. They're very oil rich, a lot of, very robust fishing. And the ICJ ruled in favor, if I remember correctly, the Philippines. China did not like that. The ICC is not part of the UN. I know that's confusing because I just told you, and in the case of Sudan in 2005, the United Nations Security Council referred the genocide in Darfur to the ICC. So again, the ICC is not part of the United Nations. However, the United Nations Security Council can refer cases to the ICC to seriously investigate and dole out any prosecutions or arrest warrants therein of. The ICC, however, can also ask things of the United Nations Security Council. They can ask for their assistance. So, for example, they can ask for arrest warrants for individuals that are guilty of international crimes. And they can ask folks like, hey, Russia, China, whomever, you're not a part of the ICC, but hey, we've got a warrant out for this person's arrest. Would you be willing to, arrest them and send them to The Hague if we needed you to? all of that should give you a really, a pretty good understanding of the court's sort of um, relationship with other entities, whether it's the United Nations or in this case the ICJ, where there's no correlation or relationship. But I think, it's necessary to kind of understand these things to kind of get why the United States, has hesitations about joining the court and why you have inherency on the affirmative. By the way, like I've heard some debate briefs, like for example, champions briefs, misinterpret what inherency is. Inherency is effectively, what structural barrier exists in the status quo that's keeping the affirmative from happening. Just to be clear, the United States is not fully acceded to the Rome Statute of the ICC. But, are they not part of the ICC? Yes and no. I know that sounds confusing. Bear with me here. The United States has a complex, contentious relationship with the ICC. The United States, kind of in Bill Clinton's lame duck period in 2000, signed the Rome Statute. There was no real desire by Bill Clinton really to kind of ratify this. It would not have gone through the Senate at that point in time. But the idea really was, there's a lot about the ICC that the United States and the Clinton administration in particular liked. They thought it would, signing onto it, but not completely ratifying it, allows the United States to have kind of 1 foot in the door, 1 foot out. It allows, future administrations to make those determinations for themselves. But it also allows the United States to kind of have a little bit of credence with possibly altering and molding the ICC in their own image. And that's really what Bill Clinton thought of in 2000 was, even if it's not a perfect product, it has some potential. And it also maybe could benefit from, the United States kind of molding the court in a way that kind of signifies and aligns with American interests. In 2002, not long after 9/11, there was very much a scorched earth sort of mentality in America, and George Bush, George W. Bush, I should say, looked to invade Afghanistan. In Afghanistan and in Iraq, there were serious human rights violations by American service members and by private military contractors that were hired out by the United States military that were killing civilians, that were doing incredibly unethical things. As you can imagine, the United States was uninterested in having, any of its military personnel or its political leaders possibly be under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. They did not want that to happen. And George Bush in particular was very concerned by this, as were members of his, cabinet. For example, there was an advisor who also was an advisor to Trump in his first term, Bolton, who just recently was in the news because Trump took away his security detail and is very concerned about the Iranians literally assassinating him. And Trump didn't like the things that Bolton said about him and removed his security detail. And now the guy is like terrified that, Iranian intelligence will snipe him, literally. I want to be clear. The United States is not a member, but it has talked about the rule of law. They've talked about accountability for international crimes. And oftentimes, the United States does support not just international justice in principle, but the ICC. For example, Biden was very vehemently in support of Putin being tried by the International Criminal Court for war crimes and crimes against humanity. That being said, the U.S. opposition to the ICC is bipartisan. Republicans as well as Democrats don't like this idea. And a lot of that is because they believe it to be a restraint on national sovereignty. The United States is concerned about the ICC's potential to target American nationals. In particular, they are concerned about the legal ramifications of having U.S. sovereignty being interfered with international courts and international crimes. The ICC also objects, or I'm sorry, the United States objects to the idea that the ICC could exercise jurisdiction over its individuals from non-member countries without their consent. So like a lot of critics contend that the ICC would allow an international body to make decisions about U.S. military personnel, and that would supersede American law. They don't like that. They don't like that at all. That is very much the concern there. In particular, Henry Kissinger, who passed away not too terribly long ago, was very concerned about the United States joining the ICC because he very much probably would have been prosecuted and tried. there are a lot of folks, especially in Cambodia, and if you don't know anything about the Khmer Rouge, if you Google it for 5 minutes or so, you're going to realize that there is a very credible concern that American diplomat Henry Kissinger is absolutely 100% a war criminal. That being said, I'm very concerned that people are going to lie to you. What I mean by that is there is a piece of legislation that was passed in 2002 called the American Service Members Protection Act. Many people have colloquially referred to this as the Hague Invasion Act, and I'm very afraid negative debaters are going to say that a natural consequence of the affirmative is going to be war. Why? Well, because the Hague Invasion Act of 2002 basically means that the United States would go to war with the ICC. That is ludicrous. That is not true. The ASPA did effectively say that, it prohibited the United States from cooperation with the ICC if there was any extradition of American citizens to the court. It would bar the US government from cooperating with the ICC if there's an investigation about a particular US citizen. This is mostly symbolic. It is not real. What I mean by that is it does not mandate in any way, shape, or form that the United States will go to war with either the Dutch or the ICC itself. I'm very afraid that the lack of expert judges in public forum allows a lot of debaters to be lazy and even unethical about their interpretation of evidence. That's why paraphrasing is such a cardinal sin in debate. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, about this particular act that indicates that the United States would invade The Hague at all. It is, however, a serious repudiation of the United States' commitment to the ICC if it were ever to kind of go against them. Now, what can the affirmative fiat? Fiat is a hypothetical implementation of the affirmative. In this case, the AF can fiat the implementation of acceding to the Rome Statute. Like, the AF gets to be a full signatory of the ICC. The AF gets to evaluate consequences based on full ratification and signing of the ICC's Rome Statute. The AF can fiat out of Trump won't join the ICC. The AF can fiat out of the Senate would never ratify the Rome Statute. Remember, the resolution says should, not would, right? So the AF should not have to worry about arguments about how the AF would never happen. However, it doesn't protect the AF from arguments like, oh, Trump would roll back the affirmative, or Trump would look to violate the ICC's Rome Statute, or do something else, or any other relevant political backlash from any party, right? If the AF were to occur. So just very quickly, what that basically means that the affirmative obviously gets the opportunity to indicate that they derive offense off of advantages as good consequences of affirming the actual topic. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you about some of the more typical and I think the stock set of arguments and advantages that will be read on the affirmative. I know a lot of y'all call them contentions. They're just the same thing. Advantages are just affirmative contentions. So court credibility, I think a lot of folks would agree, and there's a ton of literature out there that says the United States joining the International Criminal Court gives the court more credibility than it currently does in the status quo, which makes it much more likely to not only investigate and prosecute and dole out and issue warrants. It could even mean the United States actively attempts to help the court in terms of, extraditing, people who are accused of crimes to The Hague. That would be, I think, a real big boon to the ICC and help its credibility. Another sort of advantage that I think is really common will be that responsibility to protect international legal concept. It could also be something that many people would call human rights. It would be something that a lot of human rights folks feel would be beneficial. I think this is really in the same sort of line as deterring atrocities, right? Like, the idea of the courts is that if all international entities and all governmental entities realize that even if their particular nation is weak about, prosecuting those who are guilty of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, that there's an international entity that would seek them out if they were to do something that egregious. That alone, the literature suggests, would deter atrocities. Another sort of advantage that's relatively similar is about international law, how affirming would increase not just the ICC, but international law writ large, and also concepts of liberalism. If I had a little bit more time, I would talk to you about the international relations schools of thought, realism versus liberalism. Liberalism is very much on the side of the affirmative. And when I say liberalism, I do not mean like Democrats, lowercase l. I mean uppercase L in terms of international relations. The idea of liberalism is that states don't always need to be in conflict. They can create peace without the security dilemma, that international relations is not zero sum, that one nation increasing power does not necessarily need to indicate that another nation has lost relative amounts of power, that nations should coexist and collaborate together in order to resolve problems, in particular with the ICC, some of the most heinous atrocities that are understood to humanity. On the other side of that, and I think that if you're second in affirmative, the advantage about hegemony or soft power or leading global missions is something you can read, or you can just wait for the negative to make an argument about hegemony and just link turn them or no link them, right? The no link is something I described earlier, which is that complementary justice ensures that the United States will not lose hegemonic kind of power because they are not guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity that go unpunished or unprosecuted by the United States. Now, there's a very healthy debate to be had about whether or not that's true. If you Google the name of Eric Prince, you'd realize that that is not the case. The United States is definitely allowing people to commit war crimes. But I also think, it's a very strategic option to read this either, to start the debate off if you're affirmative in first, or kind of keep those arguments and just no link at best about complementary justice, or link turn and say that the United States, kind of like in that Bill Clinton kind of concept of signing the Rome Statute, increases the United States sort of soft power, right? The United States would be viewed as an entity that is not just, the world's policeman, but rather are willing to not just adhere to international law, but have that international law be applied to them as well. I think that would really help boost the United States' credibility writ large, and also help its hegemony in terms of being able to assist others. Soft power, as it results or contrasts to hard power, is a concept that international relations scholar from Harvard, Joseph Nye, talked about in 1999, about how the United States doesn't necessarily just use military to support its global agenda. It uses other things like diplomacy, markets, and even things that are cultural. For example, Hollywood. This is sort of why the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice spend so much money in Hollywood, is because these movies go global and it increases the United States kind of global and general standing in the world. And so I think even if you decide to read this as an advantage or as sort of a link turn or no link to the hedge disads that you're going to read, it's stuff that you've really got to get your hands dirty with. As for specific scenarios, I think Palestine is going to be the most typical argument you're going to hear in the affirmative. The idea would be that the United States would agree to join the International Criminal Court, and as the United States is the metropole to the settler colony of Israel, it would kind of, mitigate a lot of the disaster that has happened in Gaza and the West Bank, and maybe even the Golan Heights, maybe even in Lebanon, maybe even in Syria. You could claim advantages and offense off of all of those nations that Israel's, recently been bombing, including, even Yemen, maybe even Egypt. You could make those arguments, right? That that Israel would be brought to heel because its closest ally joined the ICC, and the ICC is looking to prosecute certain Israeli government officials that are part of the Likud party, right? So there's a lot of arguments you can make there, but I think the further you go in depth, the better, right? Like just saying like, oh, Israel has done it bad, the United States joins the ICC, Israel will stop. I don't think that is necessarily particularly helpful. I also think that Congo is an argument folks have been reading on the LD side as well. I also think that Myanmar is an argument that you could be making as well. I'm getting this question from from debate coach from Archbishop Malloy, Ryan Curran, who asks, question about the Palestine advantage. Wouldn't the neg be able to turn and say that the ceasefire deal was done? I'm genuinely curious about this. I mean, the ceasefire deal being done has not really changed anything. What I mean by that is that there are still Palestinians who are being killed at this particular point in time. A lot of folks don't believe that the ceasefire is permanent. They don't believe it's real. And also, even if it is something that has happened, Ryan, I think many folks would contend that the legal precedent is necessary to kind of stop these atrocities from happening in Palestine in the future, but also more importantly, that these people have done a bad. Benjamin Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir, they have literally killed people intentionally. It is genocide. That cannot go unpunished. That still needs to happen, right? So that's probably what the affirmative is going to contend. I don't know why I misspelled multipolarity towards the bottom, but another affirmative advantage is sort of an impact turn to hedge. I don't think you can read soft power and multipolarity together, but you can contend that the United States acceding to the ICC is a sign that hegemony really doesn't make sense in the unipolar concept, but instead we need multiple sorts of poles of power, and that the United States doing this kind of allows that regional hegemony to occur. That being said, negative disads, hedge, hedge, hedge. I mean, whether you call it hegemony or not, the vast majority of the negative disadvantages are going to basically kind of stem from the fact that the United States is giving up its power, is allowing international law to dictate its domestic policies, which hurts its ability to do things that they want and do things that they need to maintain that global primacy. Again, John Bolton cards are fantastic on this question. A lot of the literature that's the most Googleable that you're going to be able to find about hegemony is going to probably come from like the Heritage Foundation, which are the same folks who wrote about Project 2025. Again, it is a bipartisan concern. Democrats are also worried about this. I do think that there is probably some link to a politics disadvantage, which is that a bad consequence will happen in the political realm. I think this is relatively similar to a Trump backlash argument, that Trump will not just roll back the affirmative, but join some type of competing international treaties or entity that is meant to be the antithesis to the ICC. I also think you can make nation-specific backlashes. If the United States joined the ICC, Putin could take that as a desire to really incriminate him. It means that Putin would not be able to travel to the United States because he would probably get arrested and extradited to The Hague. That could lead to some really nasty things in Ukraine. I also think that folks would say the same thing about Israel. Israel would lash out, right? Like they would feel betrayed by their closest ally and could not just continue the killing of Palestinians and folks in Lebanon, but also could engage in war with Iran. I think that this is a very good and smart disadvantage. I don't know if this is a disad or a negative contention so much as it is like a negative rebuttal answer, but court politicization and lobbying, the court does not exist in a vacuum. It is open and susceptible to political concerns too. I think that the negative should find a bunch of cards that say that the United States joining kind of mitigates the court and court's effectiveness in deterring crimes, but also have a dollar or two attached to some things that they want or don't want. And it's not just neuters international law, but makes the ICC a body that is completely hollowed out for American interests. You could also contend that I law is bad. I don't know, it says IR. That should say international law is bad. Another disad that I think makes a lot of sense is that the United States could continue using PMCs, private military contractors, rather than using its own military members to facilitate military incursions, because there is a desire to insulate American service members from doing a bad and forcing either the United States to prosecute them or allowing the International Criminal Court to. And then there's also bilateral immunity agreements. I think this is interesting. It's almost kind of counterplanning, which of course you can't really do in public forum. But the idea is that, the United States can have bilateral immunity agreements with different nations about what to do about war crimes and things of that nature, especially when it comes to military incursions. And you don't really get to do that if the ICC is involved. You don't get to do that if you're subject to the Rome Statutes policies and agreed upon treaties. For those of you who are a little bit more critical, I think that critical perspectives on the topic include securitization and neoliberalism. I also think that the second sort of phrase here, and I think those of you who are interested in this should Google this, but a lot of criticisms about the International Caucasian Court. As you may have recalled from previous slides, the vast majority of cases have been in Africa. And I think it's very lazy and way too easy to say, well, that makes sense. African nations in the post-colonial onset are comprised of very young and even weak countries that oftentimes are ripe for corruption, which oftentimes lead to serious human rights violations and abuses. Of course, the ICC would try them. That makes sense on the surface, but if you look a little bit deeper, the critical perspectives of this is that this is just another product of the West attempting to create an international court where different nations play by different rules. The global North gets to make these rules and policies and implicate them on the global South while never holding themselves up to the same sort of standard or snuff. This is why it's easy to prosecute in Congo. It's easy to prosecute in Mali. It's easy to prosecute in Sudan, but you'll never try Henry Kissinger, even though he's guilty of killing far more people. Why is that, right? Well, it's oftentimes because international courts, especially that are based in Europe, are very Eurocentric and are anti-Black because they are, even if it is not intentional, they are using these easy to determine cases to build up court legitimacy and precedent that they can then try and abuse later. Now, of course, the affirmative can no-link this stuff by saying that Israel is kind of a Western-styled state in many regards, that would, potentially be brought to heel by the ICC. Like, there's a good debate to be had here, but I do think people should take them very seriously. If you're interested in militarism or criticisms of empire from folks like Hart and Negri, I think this is a great opportunity to do that. I know that there's not a lot of critical arguments in PF, but I can definitely talk about that more if any of you would like. That being said, please, if you have any questions or thoughts or concerns, please feel free to make those known. You can do that certainly in the chat. I know Freya, you had some questions too regarding the topic. This is an opportunity for you all to ask me questions if you have any at all. But yeah, in the Q&A, I hear from Leo Cheng. Do you think the affirmative could affect how military contractors like Blackwater are treated by the ICC? It's a fantastic question, Leo. I think that answer is yes. Blackwater, by the way, has rebranded again. I think they're called ZXE. But yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think in reality, the answer would be that these military contractors would be subject to American military tribunals, which is already the status quo. And if you look, Eric Prince, who I mentioned earlier, is actually the CEO and founder of Blackwater Z and is definitely guilty of everything from sexual assault to intentional killing of children in Iraq and Afghanistan. Like, it is absolutely disgusting what those folks have done. And the military tribunal against Blackwater resulted in quite literally nothing. Now, would the ICC take that on? Probably not. However, you can make that argument on either the affirmative or the negative that it actually would. It would lead to those things. So, yeah, I think that's a good question. If there are any others, please feel free. Any other questions I'm willing to take for sure. That is a very good question, Leo. I'll leave the question and answer segment a little bit open again, but if you are in the tri-state area and you are interested in competing at a tournament on March 1st, can't think of a better one than what we'll be having at the new school. I will go ahead and make sure that I upload this to YouTube. If you have any questions that you didn't think of, feel free to email me. If you're looking for some additional readings or sources, I can certainly provide that to you all as well. I'll leave the question and answer segment open again for a little bit more. For those of you asking how to access this, you can look us up on our YouTube channel, which is Tri-State Debate, which is the moniker of it all. Let me also see what more I can do about linking that into the chat, so that way you all can take a look at it. You also may have noticed that there is a video going around for the January topic as well. Tessa, I hope that answers your question. Freya asks, how would ecocide concept play out in this debate? Like, how likely is it to get amended into the statute, and is that a good argument? Well, the Rome Statute is completed. That is a done deal. If I'm understanding you correctly, I guess the question is whether or not ecocide would constitute a war crime. I think the answer is that it is possible for that to be the case. I don't think it's especially likely. And in reality, I think that that's sort of, I'm trying to see if that's effects topical or extra topical. I think it might be a little bit of both, but I think the idea of making ecocide an advantage area for the affirmative is not very likely, because again, the affirmation of the topic is the United States joining the ICC. Unless you can win some uniqueness argument that the United States seems to be very interested in making ecocide a part of the international consensus on what constitutes a war crime, probably not going to get that far. And also, I'll just be honest with you as well. I mean, and this is just sort of the example that kind of comes up to me, because this is sort of the most typical Googleable case that you're going to hear about with the ICC, is ecocide of Gaza in particular. So sometimes the Israeli forces will put cement into water aquifers and wells, or uproot and destroy crops like oranges, limes, lemons, but especially olive trees. Olive trees are a very, very large part of the agricultural community in Palestine. And so there are charges of ecocide. But I'll just be honest with you, most like entities, individuals, whomever, that are going to be considered guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity, ecocide is probably not the biggest deal to them. Ecocide may be considered to be an additional sort of example of a crime against humanity or war crime, but that is more than likely not going to be the largest sort of charge that they go after those folks for, because chances are they're probably not going to go again. Like they're not going to remember, they're the court of last resort, so they're not going to try Benjamin Netanyahu for destroying acres and acres of olive trees, but they are going to, possibly issue out a warrant for his arrest if he is guilty of genocide, right? Another question is, just to fully understand, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. One big this that decides what side argument you choose is how joining ICC will affect the United States reputation, meaning how countries view it and how other countries then have jurisdiction with more power than the court than the USA. I got to admit, Tess, I'm not especially sure if I understand what you're saying here, but an affirmative argument could be that joining the ICC increases the United States credibility, and it also increases the United States kind of standing and soft power around the world. But in terms of other nations having jurisdiction over the United States, I don't think that's the case. What I mean by that is, it doesn't mean that like Belgium now has jurisdiction over the United States. It just means that the United States is agreeing to an international treaties of international law and are willing to ensure that they participate in the court. Alex asks, how credible do you think it is that Americans like Bush will be prosecuted for crimes before a session, which I'm assuming you mean a seating? Do I think it's very likely that George Bush and other kind of, Americans who are maybe considered to be guilty, do I think it's very likely? No, I don't think it's very likely. Do I think it's very likely post-affirmative if the ICC jurisdiction was something the United States voluntarily agreed to? No, I really don't. I actually do find the structural analysis from critical perspectives to be, and again, this is just my own biased opinion, but I think most scholars would agree that the likelihood of any American being tried by the ICC, even if the United States were to join the ICC, is very limited. Oftentimes it's too wise because there just isn't a lot of political will to do that by forces that are powerful enough to really influence others. And in addition to that, the United States has a ton of leverage, political capital, and resources to be able to jockey and lobby behind the scenes in ways that maybe the general public wouldn't. So that's just sort of me pontificating on the concept. However, that is very much the core of what the negative concerns are, which is that it actually decreases America's hegemony and standing internationally, because now all of a sudden you're allowing this court to contend that your leaders are guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And that is really where the concern is. So that's a good question, Alex. I'll go ahead and answer another if any of you have any of those questions. All right. Well, with that, I am very appreciative of your time. I really hope that this was helpful. And again, if you are looking for additional resources, have questions, or just want to talk strategic concepts, feel free to email me, and I'm more than willing to kind of send some stuff. I very much hope that this is helpful. I'll go ahead and post this onto YouTube as well. Feel free to share it with some folks that you think might need some folks, or rather might need a little bit of guidance on this topic. And again, this is not a ending place, but rather just a starting point for a lot of your research and some strategic considerations you should think about executing in your debates. With that in mind, I very much am appreciative of your time, and certainly hope that this is something that you all are interested in helping out with. And if you are in the tri-state area, please feel free to come to our tournaments. We've got incredible judges, and for those of you who are looking for instruction and coaching, we bring that to our tournaments. And I don't just mean that in terms of coaching, I also mean that in terms of offering tutorials and lectures that you can interact and engage in yourself. So tristatedebate.com is a great way to do that. Feel free, if you have any questions about either Tri-State Debate or debate in general, to kind of reach out and email me. Have a great night, y'all. Thanks again.